everyone, this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 55th episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. And today we have David Malan, who is going to teach you building the mobile application. If you are a fresher and know how to build iOS application, you can earn 3 to 4 lakh. And if you are a professional and have experience, you can get much more than this. Now let's move towards the course. We will start with the remaining part of the iOS development. So let's get started.
All right, so now let me go into this file, and let's see, I'll use the simplest of programs on Mac OS, text edit, and I'm going to go into, remember, John Harvard's sites folder, which is where we put this code. I'm going to go into source 0, go into JavaScript, and go into dom1.html. So here's that web page, but now it's in an editable program. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to do things the opposite. I'm going to delete the script tag, and I'm going to put it above the form. And then I'm going to save the file. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to reload the page. So indeed, the browser now sees the change I made in TextEdit. I'm going to go back to the page itself and reload this. So the form has been reloaded on the page. And now I'm going to go ahead and type in Rob again and submit. And it seems to have broken. In fact, I see a question mark in the URL, which usually means a form has physically been submitted to a server, which I did not intend. There was supposed to be a return false. So let me start diagnosing things. So when doing the first project in the course, much as Apple likes Safari, using Chrome is probably the better browser to use from a development perspective because it has additional features, one of which is this inspector element at the bottom, which Safari has its own variant of. But I think you'll find that Chrome is useful both for mobile and desktop development. And I'm going to go into the console window here for a moment. And that's interesting. The red text, which if I zoom in, says uncaught type error, cannot set property on submit of null. So that's kind of a mouthful. I didn't really understand the first half. But on submit looks familiar, and null sounds worrisome. So let's see where in my code I use the keyword on submit. So here's my code. On submit can't call this with respect to null. So again, the error was cannot set property on submit of null. So what does this suggest is null? The no demo. Specifically, the return value of the method getElementById when passed an argument of quote-unquote demo is apparently now returning not a rectangle, but null. And null is the null object. It has no properties, certainly not one called onSubmit, which is why Chrome is freaking out and not doing anything. And in fact, Chrome and most browsers approach when there's a JavaScript error is just to forge ahead blindly. In this case, it submitted the form, irrespective of my return false. Why is all of a sudden the demo element null? Exactly. It's because the browser is parsing this code top to bottom, left to right. And at this point in the story, when I'm reading the script tag in its new location, I can call getElementById of quote-unquote demo all I want. It won't exist until we get down there. But I'm calling this line of code here, which is why sort of coincidentally, my code worked fine before, even though I put my script tag still in the file, but below. But this too, in the spirit of keeping my code separate from my HTML, feels a little hackish to just solve all of my JavaScript problems by putting my code at the very bottom of my files. Hopefully there's a better way than that. And there is, if we scroll back to our demos here, and let me go into the last version of DOM, DOM2, which hopefully works. Hello, Rob, in fact works. Let's take a look at this code here and see what's different. All right, my HTML seems to have been vastly simplified, and I'm now practicing what I've been preaching about not commingling code with my raw markup. In fairness, I've just moved it up to the top, but at least now it's inside of the head element, which at least is sort of conceptually distinct from the body, which is where the actual aesthetics of my page should be. And frankly, at this point, we could rip out this code and put it where? In a separate file called like file.js, like I suggested earlier. So we're almost there, but we'll just leave it with this example. But now I see some scary looking syntax and also one new script tag. What are we apparently loading into memory here? Yeah, jQuery. So jQuery is a super, super popular library for JavaScript. So popular that many people confuse JavaScript with jQuery itself, and they say, I know jQuery, when really they know JavaScript and they also know jQuery, but they're not alternatives to one another. What jQuery does is it allows you to dramatically simplify the amount and the complexity of code that you need to write, because some very smart people, one in particular, has spent a number of years now building up a corpus of code that just makes everyone's life easier. And it's all open source. You can read through it. It's thousands of lines long. But for our purposes, let's just focus on some of the highlights and some of the features that we'll see commonly throughout any library you might use for this first project, or really desktop development in general. So turns out there's a $, which is a popular aspect of jQuery. What does the $, represent in jQuery? What special significance does the $, have in JavaScript? It's a selector. So it is, but let's focus not so much on its functionality, but just syntactically. What is it? Syntactic sugar? It kind of is, but it's not even, I'm not even sure I'd call it that. It is just a valid symbol for a variable. So whereas in some languages $ has special meaning, like in PHP, it demarks an actual variable's beginning, or in some languages you just can't use it. You can't have a $ in a variable's name. JavaScript doesn't care. You can absolutely have a $, as the name of your variable. Now, jQuery, the folks who wrote it, just realized, oh, this would be kind of sexy if we just started using $, to represent our class called jQuery. But what this really is if I go into my code, and this is, again, dom2.html. For those who've been using jQuery for some time and just taking it for granted, this is equivalent to that. There is we'll call it a class, even though it's not quite a class, called jQuery. And it takes an argument, and that argument can be a CSS selector. In this case, it's the actual name of a global variable document, but that's all it is. So it's not quite syntactic sugar in that it has no fundamental special significance. We humans just view it as something special. All right, so more properly, jQuery is a function. And there's a hell of a lot of functionality built into that one particular function. And among the things it does, and let's go back to the common case of having $, is it wraps traditional DOM nodes. So all of those rectangles we've been talking about, jQuery wraps them in the sense of making them a little wider and a little taller and adding more properties and more methods to them. On the end of the day, inside of it is still the original rectangle, but they've simplified the means by which you can talk to that rectangle from the tree. So $, open paren, close paren, document takes that document node from the top of the tree and just gives it more functionality, more power, if you will. .ready is a shorthand way of saying no matter how big this web page is, no matter how many lines of HTML there are, only call the following function when the entire page has been loaded top to bottom, left to right. So what this means is that this line of code can now be anywhere in our page, in the head, in the body, in another file. It doesn't matter whatsoever. That means wait until the entirety of the page is literally ready. So what am I passing to the ready method? So the ready method expects an argument whose data type is apparently a function pointer, so to speak. It expects a function as its argument. And now what am I doing? It's an anonymous function, because I don't care what the thing is called. It just needs to exist and be callable. Open curly brace, and it's a little messy, but here is the other curly brace, close parenthesis. So it's starting to get a little hard to read, but notice open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open paren, open curly, close paren. So everything else is inside of this anonymous function. What is inside of this anonymous function? Turns out I'm doing the same kind of trick in the next line. $, quote unquote, sharp demo. So those of you familiar very well with CSS, this represents what? It's a CSS selector for the node whose ID is demo. So the hash sign means give me the node whose ID is demo. If you instead had .demo, that means give me the node that has a class of demo. And there's some other selectors as well. But this one means give me the one node whose ID is demo. .submit, they've simplified the wording. and jQuery does more than this, but rather than call it onSubmit, it's just called submit. And what does the submit function expect as its argument? It expects its own function, an anonymous function that it's going to kind of tuck away and call only when what happens? That element's submit handler is needed. So this is just a third and final way of associating an action, an event handler, a function, with an event, like form submission. So what happens next? Finally, it's boring again. Alert, hello, so-and-so. And in fact, I'm cheating here, or I'm mixing my syntax. What should this line 11 really be if I go into that code? Let me open up Notepad again, open up DOM2, and based on that lesson learned, what can I actually change this to? $? And hash name. So that's what I mean in part by jQuery simplifying otherwise fairly verbose code. Document.get element by ID can literally be summarized as $, because the jQuery function $, knows that when it's passed an argument that's not a global variable like document, which just gets immediately wrapped with a bigger rectangle, when it realizes, oh, this is a string, but this string starts with a hash sign, it knows that that means the rest of the word is the ID for a node in my DOM. So here again is just how jQuery simplifies our life, even though at first glance it absolutely looks more cryptic, but really it's ultimately saving us time. And again, we could factor out that code further into a JS file so that it doesn't even appear anywhere in our raw HTML. Whew.
Is that required for if you have unique ID? Two IDs have the same ID?
Good question. Is it required to have a unique ID? It is a error of syntax for you to give two elements in a web page the same ID. You might get back, I don't know offhand, you might get back an array of 2 or more nodes, but I think it's fair to say, and I think the spec probably says the behavior is undefined, certainly for a JavaScript library, but I don't know offhand. Other questions? Yeah. No longer. It's not quite that. It's just, this is literally the honor system. Like for the web to work, all of us have to agree on some rules. And one of those rules is do not screw up and give two elements in a web page the same ID. And if you do, we're not sure what's going to happen. At least I'm not sure. There might be some formal definition. I'll look it up later tonight. That's fine. If you have two elements with the same class, you'll get back an array. And the following function will be applied to that array effectively. Even though it's not quite an array, it's in a wrapper that jQuery returns. OK. All right, so not bad. But thus far, all we're doing is manipulating DOM elements. It would be nice to start introducing some functionality. So why don't we go ahead and introduce a bit of storage capabilities? So where we left off, we had this thing here. And let's jump ahead to, I'm getting much better at this, local storage. So where can you store information in a browser when programming in JavaScript? Some of you might know from past experience, or now that you know JavaScript runs client-side, you have very few options to begin with. In window. So there's this global object called window that in theory you can store data in. But if that window closes, for instance, the browser quits, what happens to any variables you've tucked away there? They disappear. And this is what a lot of popular libraries do. They'll tuck important stuff in the window object. It's effectively making something a global variable, but it's not persistent. So where else can you put it? Obviously, the answer is going to be local storage. But leading up to local storage, where else can you put it? Cookies. So you can actually write JavaScript code to plant cookies on the user's computer that didn't come from the server. They came from your local JavaScript code. But what's the downside of using cookies? Correct. There's a size limit, which is generally pretty small. And they also can sometimes be disabled by users. They might not persist as long as intended if you're in an incognito mode and the like. So there's a number of reasons where cookies get tripped off. And we're not going to solve all of those problems, but those are a couple of barriers. What else? If you have a server, you could just put it in a database, certainly. But maybe that's not ideal, especially if you're trying to make a mobile app that is fast by using local data as much as possible. So it turns out that local storage is a relatively new feature, popular in HTML5, that gives you access to another global variable, really inside the window, that is called local storage, capital S. And it has a few methods associated with it, among which are clear, which means just clear out anything I've put there already. Get item, which means give me the value of an item with a certain key. So get item takes one argument, a string, which is the identifier of whatever you put there. So for those familiar, local storage is a hash table, or it's a dictionary, or it's any number, an associative array. It can be thought of as any number of these things. Remove item does the opposite of set item, because set item takes two arguments, a key and a value, and it stores it locally in the browser. The upside of which is if you close the window, quit the browser, and don't clear the history in the computer, in the browser entirely, it's still going to be there later. So why might this be useful? Storing things like your address book for auto-completion, storing things like your inbox potentially if it's a mail application, storing a non-trivial amount of data for easy, ready access. So let's take a quick look at an example involving storage. So if we go back to today's sample code in storage.html, I have apparently visited this page 0 times. All right, if I dismiss this alert, reload this page, I have now visited this page 1 time before. All right, can guess where this is going. Reload the page 2 times before, but we just cited any number of ways where we could be storing the number 2, and then the number 3, and the number 4. It could be in a var, a variable, in the web page itself. So this isn't all that interesting. But let me go ahead and copy the URL so I don't have to remember what it was. Open a new browser window, save. Ooh, 3. It actually remembered this time. Let's play with fire. Quit the browser, reload it, visit it again. 4 times. So something is persisting. And it turns out it's relatively easy to actually implement this. If we look at the source of this page, I really kind of cut some corners on the aesthetics of the page. There's nothing actually there other than code. If we go in here and scroll down to the bottom of the page, notice that the HTML is super simple. We've got a title, a head, and a body, and then another HTML attribute. Not the only way to do this. And again, this is kind of a regression to the messier way, but it keeps the code super simple and the focus on the new stuff for now. What happens when the body is loaded, apparently? Call the greet function. So onload is like onSubmit, but it's when the body of the page is loaded. So now if we look up here, we have a bunch of lines of JavaScript code. It's a little more complex, but notice there's not much more in the head, just that familiar meta tag. And now the function called greet, what does it do? So a little new syntax here. So there's a few ways to do this, but a really rigorous way to check whether or not a variable exists in JavaScript is to take the symbol's name, in this case local storage, capital S, pass it to the type of operator, and type of is literally going to return a string whose value is number, or string, or bool, or undefined, if that variable has not yet been defined or set. So I'm literally checking for that. If the type of local storage is quote unquote undefined, then what is the implication? Or rather, is not undefined. Not undefined. But it looks like I made a typo here. Not equals equals. Feels like there's one too many equals for most languages. But it turns out that JavaScript, like some languages, does actually support different numbers of equal signs in certain contexts. Let me open the same file with TextEdit just so I can tweak some things. Zoom in here. You probably would have expected me to type this. And that it would actually work correctly too in all cases. But it's not quite as rigorous as doing this. Does anyone know what it means when you do not equals equals? Or, if easier to answer the other way, what this would mean, equals equals equals. Same instance, not quite same instance, but same value and same type. So JavaScript, as I mentioned earlier, does have disparate types, even though you, the programmer, don't specify them when declaring variables. So you don't say string, you don't say int, you don't say float. You just have access to those disparate data types. When I check the type of local storage and I say not equals equals, this is making sure that not only is the return value of type of not equal to quote unquote string, it is also at least a string itself. This is, in retrospect, a bad example because there's no instance in which this could go awry. A better example, and I'll think of one in the future, is that if I were checking the return value of some function and it could return null, for instance, but maybe it could return 0, those two values are often conflated. If you want to check a function's return value that could return null or could return 0, you can't rely on equals equals because they will implicitly cast to one another. Null is the same as 0. But if you want to check that the return value of some function is really, really null or really, really 0, not just some implicit equivalent, then you use equals equals equals. Or if you want to check the opposite, you use bang equals equals. So I apologize. This wasn't a good way to introduce that story. We'll fix it in the video.
So you're combining like multiple attributes?
Combining multiple characteristics, let's say, sure, of the values you're checking, both of the storage container you're checking, both its value and its type. Long story short, getting into this habit is not a bad thing because it means your code will never be vulnerable to those random corner cases where maybe two values could cast to the same thing. The number 1 could cast to true, the number 2 could cast to true, but true is true if you use the identity operator in this way. OK, let's not get too hung up on that and instead move on to this. Same trick as before, but let's just take for granted now that if type of local storage, open bracket, close quote, quote unquote, counter is undefined, what's the implication? So let's try to rewind this. This just says if the type of local storage is not undefined, that is equivalent logically to saying is local storage defined? Because if it is, I'm using a modern browser, supports HTML5, and therefore clearly supports local storage. This one line of code is only checking, does your browser support local storage? Second line is checking not whether local storage is supported, but specifically whether what is the case. Is there a variable called counter inside of local storage? So local storage is, again, a hash table, a dictionary, an associative array, a key value storage mechanism, however you want to think of it. This is just saying if we have never before defined a value for quote unquote counter, what do I want to initialize its value to, apparently? I want to just give it a value of 0. So this just means if this is the first time the person's ever visited the site, obviously local storage isn't even going to know that I care about a variable called counter. So let's make that exist and assign it the value of 0. Then let's trigger that alert. You have visited this many times. And then what do? Increment it again. So this just ensures that that one-time corner case is covered. Else down here, your browser does not support local storage is what happens if it is, in fact, undefined. So where am I actually storing the value? Well, I'm not actually using set item or get item. It actually suffices just to use this array notation. So this is because local storage itself is an object, and we can treat it as though it's an array with this square bracket notation, syntactic sugar, if you will. But in this case here, we're setting the value, and in this case here, we're setting the value as well by just doing a traditional plus plus. All right. So why might that be useful? Storing user preferences potentially, or other things where you might want to remember some details about the user without having to query the server again and again for the same answer. All right. If you switch the browser, in what sense?
Like you open a Safari to open the same HTTP.
Oh, good question. That won't work. This is browser specific. So if I visit the page in Chrome, I get local storage within Chrome. If I then open Safari, Safari and has its own local storage container for me. It does not propagate across browsers. Yeah?
Are there limits to how much data you can store locally?
There is. I don't remember the value offhand. It's much bigger than a cookie, but not infinite, if that helps. That will be my other mental note to check, and as RJ is probably reminding me now. Yeah?
Use it easily remove this local storage, delete just like cookies, like cache?
Yes. So I believe one of the various settings in Chrome, let's see, clear browsing data, one of these should apply to, it's probably the one that's simplified as empty the cache. That probably includes local storage. Good question. And then you can programmatically clear it by calling the clear method. All right. So let's introduce one particularly cool feature that we can leverage in a mobile context by introducing this guy. So it turns out, and this is sort of retro if you were around when the internet was popular with Netscape, Navigator, the Navigator global object, Similar in spirit to window and document, has special properties or methods associated with it. And navigator in this case, navigator refers to the browser itself as opposed to the window or the document that you're actually viewing. .geolocation is an API, an application programming interface, a set of functions, maybe properties that you, the programmer, can use to talk to the browser. Inside of this API is at least one method of interest today, getCurrentPosition. Now, this is a method that we can call just like getItem or setItem, but it works a little differently in that it doesn't just give me back the value right away. Finding the user's location is what's called an asynchronous problem to solve, right? Because it might take a few seconds to turn on the Wi-Fi antennas or the GPS radio and figure out where the user is. And one of the key design features of JavaScript is that as much as possible, things should be asynchronous, so that when something's happening over here, it doesn't block something else from happening here. You don't want the whole browser to lock up while you're trying to figure out the user's location. It would be nice if they could keep doing other things. So the means by which you can implement that design goal is by way of what are called callback functions. And we've seen these already, but now we can use them even more deliberately with this geolocation example. So let me go back to my directory listing and go into geolocation0.html. And I actually don't see anything yet, but what do I see apparently in my browser? Localhost wants to use your computer's location. So my computer's location, physically, GPS, latitude and longitude. Thankfully, Chrome is giving me a little bit of defense here and not just telling a random website, even though it happens to be running on localhost, where I am in the world. I mean, this could get down to a pretty precise location. And you don't want just to give that information out to anyone that asks for it. So if I go over here, I can deny or allow this. Well, let's allow this. And now let's see what happens. Apparently, this page's purpose in life is just to tell me my GPS coordinates with some degree of confidence. So we're at 42.3, negative 71.1. So if we look that up on Google Maps, we'll probably end up in roughly that location. Let's actually see if we can search Google by GPS coordinates. Let's go to the actual maps.google.com, search here. And indeed, we are, let's turn on satellite view. My laptop is underneath the grass there. And that's actually, it is true. We are in the basement. So it's pretty darn accurate. So how in the world does my laptop, which does not have a GPS radio, I'm not using my phone or anything in this context, how does Google know where my laptop is? So Wi-Fi, how do you mean? OK, so these are Wi-Fi antennas. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them in this room alone, at least. And those Wi-Fi radios all have unique identifiers of some sort. They have the SSID to which we connect, like Harvard University, and they have other metadata associated with them. For years, there was a technique known as Wardriving, which was like literally people in cars driving around trying to find open access, Wi-Fi access points for various reasons. And companies, among them Google, do this too, to figure out, just by driving around, for instance, where do you hear Harvard University? And they carry around a GPS radio with that computer program to say, I heard Harvard University at these GPS coordinates. But the world has gotten even more sophisticated than 10 years ago. Nowadays, we don't need cars driving around campus. Who is doing all of this snooping for us? Like all of us idiots, right? Every one of us that has one of these cell phones in our pockets that has a GPS radio and also has Wi-Fi or 3G or LTE access can be phoning home to Apple in this case, or if you have an Android phone, to Google in that case, if you have a Windows phone, to Microsoft in that case, telling the world when you're on the Harvard University network what your GPS coordinates are, when you're on the Starbucks network what its GPS coordinates are. So all of us are effectively phoning home and training these big companies to know with some degree of probability where we are. And clearly it works pretty well, but that's because we've all been helping them for some time. So putting aside the fear factor, let's just focus on the positive, which is what we can now do with this functionality. So apparently any random guy on the internet making a web page who knows some JavaScript and has a web server can write JavaScript code that asks the user for his or her location and then does something with it. In this case, totally underwhelming in that we just prompted the user with their GPS coordinates. But what could you use the location for to be more a sexier application? You could show the user's location on a map, right? I kind of implemented that myself manually by going to Google Maps and pasting it in. We could do that programmatically by using the Google Maps API. The website could tell me where the nearest Starbucks is based on my location. It could tell me what the news is for Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the weather for Cambridge, Massachusetts, because it knows where my coordinates are. So there's a number of things that can just lower the bar to giving me things that I might be interested in. So it's a pretty compelling user feature, albeit at utter cost of privacy. So how do we go about leveraging this? Let's look at the source code. This is geolocation0.html. Notice again, the body of the page is super simple with an onload attribute whose value is geolocate, arbitrary named function that I wrote. Could have called it whatever we want. Open paren, close paren means call it. And now if we look at the head of my page where the script is, again, I could be putting this code in a separate file, but I've kept it in the HTML file so all the demos are self-contained. Notice that we have two functions. One is literally called callback, and it takes an argument called position. Let's come back to that in a moment. One is called geolocate, no arguments. What does it do? It first checks if the type of navigator.geolocation is not undefined. So what does it mean if geolocation is not undefined? The browser supports it, which means we can proceed to use it without throwing one of those red error messages where like symbol not found or something like that. So navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, and then I'm passing in what? Callback. But notice, there's a close paren around callback, but what is there not? There's not a pair of parentheses right next to callback itself. So am I calling callback here? So no, I'm just passing its address effectively. I'm passing a reference to that function to the function called getCurrentPosition so that he can call callback when he's ready. Now, why might it take some time? Well, we just saw an example. If the browser prompts me, the human, to decide yes or no, share my location, that could be a minute later, a second later, an hour later. You don't necessarily want the whole web page to lock up while you're waiting for the user's input. So instead, you do this asynchronous trick, whereby this function, getCurrentPosition, will return immediately. Close paren, semicolon, called. But it will call my callback function when it's ready to give me the GPS coordinates, which could be a second, a minute, an hour later. That function, when called, takes an argument called position. It turns out, and I figured this out by reading the documentation, inside of the position, as returned by this function, as passed by this function, is another property called coordinates, inside of which more specifically is a latitude coordinate and a longitude coordinate. So by accessing latitude and longitude and just concatenating them with a comma and a space, I get that very simple prompt that we saw a moment ago. So it's as simple as that. But we can refine this a little bit. Let me open up geolocation 1, which looks like it has the same behavior. But if I view the page source this time, what have I done differently? I'm sort of learning from past mistakes or reapplying past improvements. What's different fundamentally about this example? It's not undefined. So this we had before, though. Yeah, so I have a lambda function, an anonymous function, a nameless function where here, so what function name did I used to use? Literally callback. It could have been called anything. I just called it a callback. But if it's a callback whose purpose in life is to get called once in only one location and never again, why am I wasting time confusing me and subsequent readers of the code with multiple functions? Just put it where I want it. Now notice function, open paren, close paren, position. So I'm still taking the same arguments. I'm just not bothering to give it a name. Then I call the alert. And I have to be careful. Notice I have open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open curly brace. So down here, I have to remember to close the curly brace, close the close paren. So that's the only price you pay and just a bit of syntactic potential for confusion. All right, it's pretty cool what you can do with the browser. Questions? All right, let's do one last big feature that'll take us home here. So here I have an example called Ajax0.html. I said a moment ago, Ajax is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, though that's kind of a white lie these days because it doesn't always, and if ever, use XML these days. What does it do, Ajax, for us? So let's synchronously load data from servers or asynchronously. So both, actually. So the A means asynchronous, but you can run it in both modes. And it looks like this, which is a wonderful picture, which makes this super simple. Oh, it's actually pretty simple once we look at it. So here we go. Ajax is just a technique. It is the application of built-in features of JavaScript to programmatically get more data from a web page after the original web page is loaded. So we've seen this for years, thanks to things like Google Maps. For instance, when you click and drag on a Google map, before you see more of the Earth, you often see little gray tiles, gray squares, before those portions of the map have downloaded. But thanks to Ajax, the code Google wrote in JavaScript can ask google.com, give me more tiles, give me more tiles. Sometimes that takes a few seconds if the network is slow, and that's why those tiles only gradually appear. Twitter and Facebook and Gmail and GChat, all of these tools that you might use that update themselves over time are using Ajax to go get more data. Rewind 10, 15 years when you had sites like MapQuest, which still exists, and I think you still use it in the same way. When you click the up arrow or the down or the left or the right arrow to move the map, it would reload the whole darn page. That's before the days of Ajax. So Ajax lets us create the illusion of dynamically changing content without having to force reload some whole page. All right, so here's a picture that makes it less clear. So we have a user interface, namely the browser, use some JavaScript in step 1. And this is actually worth knowing, or at least tucking away. The feature of JavaScript that makes this possible is called an XML Http Request object. So much like we saw geolocation, much like we saw the local storage, this is another keyword introduced to JavaScript a few years ago that allows us to make these asynchronous calls back to the server. All right. Once you have instantiated one of those objects, as we'll see, you send an HTTP request to the server. Can't do that anymore. Send an HTTP request to the server. It responds years ago with XML data, and occasionally still today. And then your JavaScript code parses this thing called XML. If unfamiliar, XML is like homemade HTML. It's make your own tags, make your own attributes. But there's a simpler format these days called JSON, JSON, which is more popular and lighter weight. So when you get this XML back, you then do something with it. So this is a cryptic 5-step way of explaining how Google and Facebook and GChat and Twitter go about dynamically updating their DOMs without reloading the whole page. They're just making more HTTP requests across the wire. And we can probably see this. What might be, let's see if I can pick a site that without logging in would do this for us. What is a site that could do this? Google Live Stream? No, that doesn't work.
Probably go to someone's Twitter page and just wait for it to.
Twitter. Yeah.
Based on a hashtag.
Who's a famous? Well, no, that won't work. We need someone. Almost every site on the internet does this today, and I can't think of one.
Just go to Twitter and find some trending topic.
Okay. What's trending? Let's choose something acceptable. Oh, only I am seeing the material. There we go. All right. What's happening right now? What's popular today? News. All right. 5 hours ago or 3 minutes ago. Well, let's see. There must be some aspect here. Let's see if we can cheat. This is a horrible demo. OK, so let me fake the story, and then I'll come better equipped. I will stop doing spontaneous demos is what I'll do. So what I did was I opened the same tool that we opened earlier, which is Chrome's Inspector tab. And again, Safari and IE and Firefox have these same kinds of tools. And oh, there we go. And I clicked on the Network tab because, as I expected, we would have this little row appear here, and if we waited long enough, so what happened is apparently Twitter's JavaScript code is making an Ajax call every half a minute, however often that's going to flash on the screen. And if I hover on this, you can see that the URL that was requested was this long one here, twitter.com/i/search. And that is because Twitter instantiated one of those XML HTTP request objects and just made an HTTP request from the client-side JavaScript code that I downloaded a minute ago back to their servers, presumably checking for more tweets. And there might not be new tweets, but they're at least polling their servers to check for it some amount of time. And indeed, if I click on this request, we won't go into much detail here on this, but you can see all of the HTTP headers. You can see exactly what came back in the response. Apparently, there were more items. There's a key called has more items. So Twitter is actually using JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, instead of XML. But any site, if you are a Facebook user, Gmail, GChat user tonight, use Chrome, log into one of those websites, and just watch the network tab of the Chrome inspector, and you'll see pretty constant traffic. Certainly if there's a busy site or if you're chatting back and forth with friends, you'll see all of these HTTP requests. This is arguably what makes the web or web development really interesting these days, in that you can make much, much more dynamic sites as a result. So this site, as we'll see, allows me to get a stock quote. Let me type in something like GOOG, which is the ticker symbol for Google, get quote, and there's an error with the Ajax call. So why might this be? So let me go back over here to my, let's see how to do this. Let's open Ajax 0. That's why. Typo. GOOG, get quote. There we go. So I renamed the file earlier and forgot to change it in the HTML. So apparently, as of 4:30 p.m. or so today, the Google stock price is $869.79. So I did not know that in advance, though technically I could have just hard-coded this, I suppose, after 4:30 p.m. for a 6:30 class. But this was, in fact, fetched dynamically. And if you use the same demo tomorrow morning, you would get a different answer slightly. And certainly for other websites, we could get back different stock quotes. So let's see how this is working underneath the hood. If I view the page source, let's scroll down to the easier part first. There's some HTML at the bottom. And it's really just a super simple form that borrows some of the lessons learned from earlier. On submit, call what function? Quote. This isn't a built-in function. This is apparently one I wrote up above that we'll look at in a second. Return false so that it doesn't actually submit to the server in the traditional way. So Ajax is all about sending data to the server. It's just I don't want it to be submitted via that form per se. I want it to be submitted via my code, my event handler up above. So this symbol is an input. Autocomplete is off. It has an ID of, let's scroll to the right, quote-unquote symbol. That's probably going to be useful. So I can uniquely identify what the user typed in. So let me zoom out and scroll back up. And you're going to see some mess of a code. And here, too, jQuery will make our lives better. So at the top of my script tag, I have a variable called XHR. Could have called it anything, XML Http Request, initializing it to null, just so that the variable exists for me. Down here, I have a function called quote with some simple comments above it to remind me. And now we have kind of a mess of code that, again, is dramatically simplified by libraries. But I'm going to try to instantiate a new XML HTTP request object. If something goes wrong, something called an exception is going to be thrown. The browser specifically, if it has no idea what this symbol is, XML HTTP request, because I'm using Netscape 1.0 or many versions of IE, it will throw an exception that I am prepared to catch. If I do catch it, I am going to reasonably, but not definitively, assume that it's what browser? So there's a lot of this kind of code on the internet because IE 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 to some extent have not always played so nicely with certain standards. And all the browsers kind of cut corners here and there. But this is just an example of error checking code. And what jQuery will do for us in just a few moments is collapse all of this messiness and all of this care about what browser the user is using into a simple function call. But what's really going on underneath the hood is something like this. So this is raw JavaScript code. I proceed to check if the XHR object is null, then I'm going to return an alert saying Ajax is not supported in your browser, but we didn't see that. And then down here, I'm going to do just a little bit more work to make this magic happen. I'm going to declare a variable called URL, whose value is quote.php. It happens to be written in PHP, but that's just because it's a language I know. I'm running it on a PHP-supported server. XAMPP comes with support for PHP. Question mark symbol equals, and then what am I concatenating on is the value of that URL, its parameter. whatever the symbol's value is that the user typed into the DOM. So the only thing new in this example besides the exception handling stuff is the fact that I'm using PHP. But we're not even going to look at the PHP code. Just know that it's returning dynamically a price using some PHP code talking to Yahoo Finance in real time. Yes, we will simplify all of this code in a moment with jQuery to get rid of most of these lines. So the last thing I need to do is actually contact the server. All I've done thus far is create a string, a variable, that is a URL. Now I need to do something with that URL. So I need these 3 lines. My XHR object, which again is my sort of gateway to the server for this feature called Ajax. Horrible property name, on ready state change. What am I going to call? Call my handler function. So in a moment, we'll see a function called handler. And this is just my way of saying, hey, special object, when you change state, when you turn on, when you turn off, call this function so I can check what's going on, is what that boils down to. Open is opening a TCP connection to the server, HTTP specifically connection using the get method if familiar. If not, don't worry. It's the opposite of post. To this URL, making the call asynchronous. Asynchronous means this function will return immediately. And handler will get called when the server, if the server eventually replies. By contrast, if we made this false and said make the open call synchronous, that would mean that this function open would not return until the server answered back to me, which is not what we want. We don't want the whole page to lock up just in case the server is slow. Finally, send null just means I have no more arguments, no post data, just send the request. So some number of milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours later, the handler function will get called because the state of this object will change just because the network responds, the server responds with an answer. What does handler do? It's pretty straightforward. It first checks this, and you would only know this from looking in the documentation, if the ready state value of the object is 4. So there's literally a cheat sheet. 4 is good. 4 means the whole thing is done. The request went, it came back, it's been examined, and it's ready for you. If you're in request state 4 and the server's response was 200, 200 is the opposite of something like 404, 403, 401, 500 error codes that if you ever see them are bad. 200 is one you never see because it's good, literally OK. The request worked. Then go ahead and alert the user with a window to xhr.responseText. And again, you'd only know this from looking at the documentation. Response text is the value of whatever the server spit out. And in this case, all the server spit out was $800 and some odd, just a super simple text string. In the case of Google Maps, it would have spit out a ping or a JPEG or a GIF. In the case of Facebook, it would have spit out a status update. In Twitter, it would spit out a tweet, and so forth. In this case, it's just a stock price. So how can we simplify this code? Well, let me go into a slightly cleaned up version. Yeah. Oh, sure. It was just a stupid mistake on my part. If I go into the source of Ajax 0, you'll have to fix this as well. And I'll fix this tonight online and re-upload the file. I had accidentally called the file quote1.php, but it's actually quote.php. I renamed it earlier. So I'll fix that permanently. Ajax1.html. So here is a version that we have not looked at its source code, but you can kind of guess that this is a little better. In what sense is this example about to be better designed? Yeah. Yeah. No annoying alert. We're kind of doing something that approximates the idea of what Twitter and Facebook do, is that they update the DOM. They change the contents of the web page itself by inserting new data dynamically. So where I say to be determined, let's hope that's actually true. First, let me look at the source and make sure I didn't mess up the file name. It's OK. I did correct this one earlier. So now if I type in goog, get quote, the page has dynamically updated itself. If I reload the page, notice it goes back to its defaults. And now let me show you one other feature of Chrome's inspector. And again, different browsers have this in different forms. I'm going to go ahead and control-click or right-click on the word determined, or really anywhere in that area. I'm going to click Inspect Element. And notice what happens. By default, I'm already on this Elements tab. But if and I'll zoom in a moment, if I choose Inspect Element, notice that the browser very helpfully expanded the HTML in this Inspector tab and highlighted the actual HTML that I asked it to inspect. So no matter how messy your HTML is, which it shouldn't be, this inspector shows you everything beautifully hierarchically, essentially giving you a navigable version of the DOM. This is the tree, and it's indented exactly as it should be to convey the notion of hierarchy. So watch what happens now. It's going to be a little small, so I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to type in GOOG. I'm not going to hit enter or submit yet. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here. And now I'm going to hit enter while this is on screen. And what do you expect should happen to the actual DOM, which again, the inspector here is showing me? It should actually change. That rectangle's value should be changed from to be determined to $800 something. So here we go, enter. And indeed, it actually changed. So this probably didn't take much effort because we're just replacing the alert function with something slightly more elegant. And indeed, if I go into my handler function, notice there's only one real change. I've replaced my alert line with this guy here. Document.getElementById of quote unquote price. But wait a minute, we haven't seen a price ID before. But you can probably infer. Where is it probably? The text. Which text? The to be determined. So let's actually go to the HTML because I must have made some other change here. Oh, interesting. So price colon. It does say to be determined, and there was a boldface tag, but I also wrapped it with an inline element, a span element, which is like a div, but it doesn't force a line break. And I gave it arbitrarily, but usefully, an ID at value of price so that I can uniquely identify that string there. So now up above, let's see what the rest of this line is. Get element by ID of price dot inner HTML. So there's different ways of doing this, and this is somewhat of the kludgy approach. The right way to do this would be to create a new text node, to remove the old text node, insert or append the new text node, and it would take 3 lines of code. It actually tends to be slower, at least if you're doing this for lots of nodes in a DOM like a Facebook or a Twitter does. Inner HTML literally just says cram the new content where the old HTML should be without actually parsing it like DOM objects. So this gets the job done here. If I scroll to the right, I'm just pushing the response text, the $800 string, into the innermost HTML of that span, which is why we saw the DOM element update a moment ago. So if we do it again to recap now with that context, and I pre-type in goog, I don't hit enter yet, but I instead scroll down to where it says to be determined, is the span tag going to be replaced or the bold tag? Just the bold tag, because when I uniquely identify the span element by its ID, called price, and change its inner HTML, that won't blow away the span tag itself, just its inner HTML, which is apparently a boldface tag and a line of text to be determined. So if I hit enter, sure enough, that changes. It would be somewhat counterproductive if the act of updating the span tag with the unique ID of price has the effect of blowing away that span tag with the unique ID, because then I could never update it a second time, maybe a minute or so later if I actually did this in a loop with a timer. All right, let's clean this up ever so slightly more. In ajax2.html, if I view the source here, notice that I've done away with quote.php. The one thing I don't like about those previous 2 demos is that it requires that I be running a web server that supports PHP, that I have written in advance a file called quote1.php, and that 3, the reader knows something about PHP to actually look at it. In reality, it's a super short file. It's not hard to understand, but it's still a dependency. If the whole point, at least of this portion of the course, is to do client-side development and not have to get tied down to some language like Java or Python or Ruby or PHP, it'd be nice if we can eliminate my PHP dependency altogether. Now, the catch is that there's a problem. Yahoo, as I said before, is the one supplying the data. Long story short, Yahoo Finance lets you grab data in CSV format, sort of poor man's Excel format, which is nice because it's just text, and I can parse it by splitting on the commas that separate the values. The problem, though, is that because of a policy called the same origin policy, when you write JavaScript code and you query a server like Yahoo for data using JavaScript, Yahoo can reply to you and give you that stock price, but you are not allowed typically to do anything with the value that involves manipulating your DOM. In other words, if you have a DOM from your own server, from the HTML, and you're running some JavaScript code that talks to Yahoo, and Yahoo says, here's a piece of data for you, you cannot add that piece of data to your own DOM. It sort of breaks a barrier that's meant to exist between your site and others so that certain threat scenarios don't necessarily arise. This is obviously kind of a problem. I worked around this in the first two examples by writing quote.php, who's a middleman, a proxy of sorts that gets the data from Yahoo, then replies to me, so that rather than the data going Yahoo to browser, it's going server, Yahoo, server, browser. But now I'm this middleman. God forbid my server goes down. Now my website won't even work in terms of the PHP code. So it's just an unnecessary barrier. Not to mention it requires code that I write on the server. It'd be really nice if I could just talk to Yahoo. Some companies allow you to grab their data via JSON-P format, JavaScript object notation padded format. This is just a fancy way of saying it's a different type of JSON. We've seen JSON briefly in the browser, but it's actually super simple. You may recall from earlier that what is the syntax for an array? If I have an array, we'll call it foo. In JavaScript, how do I give myself an empty array? Square brackets. How do I give myself an array containing the number 42? Like this, 42, 43, 42, 43, 44. So it's just as you would expect in most any similar language. What about now an object? An object in JavaScript is just the incarnation of a hash table, an associative array, a dictionary, a collection of key value pairs. The syntax for an empty one is this. How do we have key value pairs? We only briefly glimpsed this earlier, but you do it in this form, key, value. And if you want another one, key 2, value. And this is a bit of an oversimplification. To be super proper, JSON keys and values need to be quoted, even though this is a pain in the neck. It's not strictly necessary in JavaScript. It is necessary in JSON. So this now is a collection of 2 key value pairs. So what if I want to get back an array of objects? I could get back an array of key, this is going to get tedious quickly, value, key 2, value. We'll stop there. So you can combine these basic syntactic constructs to come up with arrays of objects, objects with arrays inside of them, and so forth. This is essentially JSON. It's JavaScript object notation. So when Google sends back data, when Twitter sends back data, when Facebook sends back data, they're not usually using XML, which looks like HTML these days. They're using this because it's much lighter weight and more compact, among other reasons. So what's the point here? Well, if Yahoo Finance were spitting out not just JSON, but padded JSON, I could work around the same origin policy. And we won't dwell too much on the details, but padded JSON means that the data coming back from a server can be embedded into your website. As you'll see in the first project, the spec for which we'll release online on Wednesday, there is a service that is coincidentally made by Yahoo called YQL, Yahoo Query Language, that simply allows you to query websites like Yahoo Finance, Facebook, Google, Twitter, any website on the internet. And if they expose their data as JSON data or XML data, Yahoo Query Language will allow you to fetch that data, and it will wrap it in this modified version of JSON called padded JSON, so that you can integrate the results into your own page. So this will become much more clear in the project spec. But for now, notice that the solution is as simple as a URL that looks like this. So this URL, though, notice, hits Yahoo, their YQL server. Notice that if I really look hard in here, you can also see finance.yahoo.com mentioned. So this is essentially a URL. It took me a couple minutes to construct, and they have a little GUI that helps you figure out what the syntax should be. But this just is a URL that's going to tell Yahoo's query service to go ask Yahoo Finance for a stock quote, then return it to me in padded JSON format. And the only difference with padded JSON is that whereas Twitter a moment ago returned to us a string that looked like this, padded JSON would literally return something that looks like this, so that you are tricking the server effectively into returning a snippet of JavaScript code that looks exactly like a function call. And so long as I, the developer, have written a function called callback or whatever it is, my data will get passed to that function. thereby circumventing the story that I've told, even though we haven't tripped over it ourselves. And again, you'll deliberately encounter this in the first project, and this is why you'll be using YQL to get data back from a server so that you don't have to use PHP or Python or Ruby or Java or anything in the appliance. All of your code will be client-side, and you won't run afoul of this restriction. But we promised to simplify this. So our last touch to this Ajax example, which still works the same, Goog, pops up the $800. If I view the page source, notice that I can now simplify my code as follows. I'm still using this longer URL, but that's just so that I'm avoiding the same origin issue. I could change this back to quote.php. Here is how in jQuery I can get a quote. I call $.Ajax. So this looks a little weird, but again, remember that the $ is just shorthand notation for a function called jQuery. So this is jQuery.ajax. As is common in JavaScript, as you'll see with various libraries online, many functions take not a comma-separated list of arguments as their values. They often take an object of key value pairs so that the order does not matter. It's just a nice convention. Perl does this a lot, and Python can do this, and other languages. So this is saying one of the keys being passed into this method is called data type, quote unquote JSON-P. I'm just telling jQuery what response to expect back. The URL has a value of URL, and that's it. There's a little bit of magic. Turns out, and this is just to pave the way for the first project, notice that somewhere in this long URL, I have told Yahoo that my callback function will be called handler, the name we've used before. So jQuery is actually, and this is one of these hidden features, well, it's in the documentation, but it's not obvious. jQuery, if it notices that you are contacting a server with a parameter whose value is callback equals something, jQuery will very nicely assume that, oh, when I get a response from this URL, I'm going to call your function called handler, which just means that we're on the honor system here. I just have to make sure to implement this thing just like I did before. So handler expects a response. I happen to know by reading Yahoo's documentation, if the response object has a query property, has a count value of 1, that means I got back 1 stock price. And it took some trial and error to figure out what the server was sending me, but I figured out that it should equal 1. And when that happens, I should output response.query.results.row.price. Very convoluted number of steps to get to that point. But again, you'll see in the first specification of the project exactly what that's doing and why it's doing it. Questions on, I know that was a lot. Questions on Ajax, having just started JavaScript an hour ago.
When the server calls a callback function, can it also pass the status value?
Yes, when the server calls the callback function, it passes in the response argument. Also tucked away in that response argument, which I didn't bother using this time, are the 200 and details like that. Because jQuery similarly checks those kinds of things for me, so I don't have to worry as much about it. All right, so that was jQuery. So that only leaves a semester of Objective-C. So Objective-C, as we will see, is much more mind-bending, at least at first for most people, than JavaScript. But rest assured that this coming week, on Wednesday, we'll have our first labs with RJ and Rob. It'll be an opportunity to dive in hands-on with some of this code. And some of you seem to be following along with some of it. But we'll look at other examples that apply these same concepts. And we'll also give you a tour of the first project, which will involve mashing together some location information, some weather, some news, some HTML, some JavaScript. And we'll leverage concepts like Ajax and the like, but won't necessarily go into as much detail as some of these things here. And you'll see the Spec 2 will hold your hand through a tour of some of these concepts and technologies that might be unfamiliar. And 2 weeks hence, in the Lab 2, we'll also offer another opportunity to explore that material and specifically explore the project, for which there are roughly 2-week deadlines, as you can see in the course's syllabus, which is at cs76.net. But very quickly, we'll be transitioned to Objective-C. So what we'll do next Monday when we return for lecture, and I unfortunately have to be at a conference, Rob will be leading us on Monday, we'll be diving into Objective-C itself. For those unfamiliar, Objective-C is a superset of C. For those unfamiliar with C, we will give you a crash course on Monday in C and everything you need to know about memory management and pointers and the syntax thereof, so that we can focus really on the OO features of Objective-C and then transition toward the end of next week, or rather the start of week 3, to the iOS SDK, Software Development Kit. And even though next week we'll spend some of our time in Xcode and or at the command line, ultimately we'll spend most of the semester in a tool that looks like this. I've opened up most of the panels for this particular screenshot, but Xcode, which is Apple's integrated development environment, similar in spirit to NetBeans or IDE or similar tools, if you're familiar, is kind of designed to make programming fun and look like iTunes, such that once you write your program, all you do is hit play and everything just works nicely in the simulator, or if you connect a USB cable, it will burn the software onto your device if you so choose. But through this environment, we'll use Objective-C. We'll use a tool called Interface Builder that allows you to construct fairly simple but fairly quickly user interfaces that are very similar in spirit to iOS 6's paradigm. You'll be then able to compile and run them in the simulator, or if you have a device, again, we'll set you up with that. A word on iOS 7. The tragedy of a summer course in the tragedy of WWDC, which is Apple's conference, which always happens like 2 weeks before the semester begins, is that they always start to they announce that things are changing, and then they actually change like 2 months later. So we're in this sort of weird limbo state. But thankfully, there's nothing. Most of the changes in iOS 7 are aesthetic so far as we would be concerned for a class like this. Underneath the hood, there's new functionality, there's some new methods, there's some new constants and the like, but nothing that will fundamentally change any of the things we do over the next 6 to 7 weeks. So you can rest assured legitimately with this transition to iOS 6 and 7 that everything we explore will continue to apply. That wasn't the case from iOS 5 to 6, where some fundamental aspects of Objective-C itself were altered. So if you're a bit worried about that, rest assured that we'll be OK. And the transition to iOS 7 should be a fairly smooth one for you if you take things further. Beyond that, we will ultimately start in a couple weeks' time with the simplest of Hello World applications and then go much, much beyond that. That's it for tonight. I'll stick around for questions with Rob or RJ. Otherwise, we will see you on Wednesday across the hall in B108. See you then.
That's all in this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will begin with another interesting episode of another interesting course, which is creating websites using SQL, Python, and Flask. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, app development, programming, and building rich UIs, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.